Hey, it's Lawrence here, bringing you another episode on high intensity business. One of the things I've really enjoyed lately is collaborating with exercise scientists to go through entire research papers. If you're like me, it can be so tempting to just read an abstract and draw a conclusion from that abstract without really understanding the science in detail, the methods that were used. But it can be really challenging and time-consuming to consume entire research papers, especially if you're not a trained scientist and don't really understand the methods and all the scientific jargon. So, to help with that, in this particular episode, I brought on Dr. James Steele, who's one of my favorite people and one of my favorite guests ever on High Intensity Business. And we went through one of his recent papers called Does Increasing an Athlete's Strength Improve Sports Performance? A critical review of suggestions to help answer this and other causal questions in sports science. Now, this is an absolutely fascinating paper and will be very helpful to you if you train clients who enjoy playing sports on the sides. Maybe they play sports in the evenings or are weekend warriors playing for some kind of sports team on the weekend. It's really important to obviously understand how your service is helping them with their needs and their goals. Maybe they want to improve sports performance or have more resilience. We know from this research that strength training might not actually improve sports performance, but there are other outcomes that it does improve, and it does certainly reduce the risk of injury in sport, most likely. And so developing a better understanding of this will really help you to serve your clients better. Please subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. We're everywhere these days. We're on YouTube. We're on pretty much every podcast app available. So please subscribe to get notified when we release a new episode every week. And please head on over to highintensitybusiness.com/tactics to get access to free resources to help you grow your high intensity training business. And without any further ado, please enjoy part one of this two-part podcast with Dr. James Steele. Lawrence Steele here, and welcome back to highintensitybusiness.com. This is episode 283, and today's topic is we're going to be discussing a paper. The paper is called Does Increasing an Athlete's Strength Improve Sports Performance? A critical review with suggestions to help answer this and other causal questions in sports science. Today's guest is my good friend and previous podcast guest many times, Dr. James Steele. James is Associate Professor of Sport and Exercise Science at Steele University and is also the Principal Investigator at the UK Active Research Institute. He has extensive research and consultancy experience in physical activity, exercise and sports, working with elite athletes across a range of sports, the general population across the lifespan, and both those who are healthy and diseased. There's much more, of course, but I thought I'd keep the bio succinct. James, welcome back to the podcast, mate. Great to have you.
Always a pleasure, Lawrence.
Always. So, been excited to talk about this paper with you today. Went through it today, and I'm not going to lie, it was pretty challenging for my brain. Harder than the last one we covered, but not in a bad way. Obviously, it's a very interesting paper, but just complicated. So I'm excited to be able to have this discussion with you, so you can help me understand it better, and I'm sure my listeners would appreciate it too. And we're talking about how does increasing an athlete's strength improve sports performance, and I thought this would be so helpful for a lot of the trainers in high intensity training in terms of how they communicate and educate some of their clients, whether they be athletes or just clients who have maybe they're weekend warriors or have some kind of recreational sport interest. And I think this will help inform, again, their instruction, their education, the kind of knowledge base, and then maybe their training protocols as well. So I figured we'd just go through it chronologically or sequentially like we did last time in the last podcast. So do you want to just kind of kick this off with an introduction to the paper, and then we'll go from there?
Yeah, sure. I think it actually builds quite nicely on what we discussed last time, because it's very much about tackling that kind of applied implementation end of the spectrum. And specifically, this paper is highlighting a distinct gap we have in our knowledge around the effects of certain practices and interventions that are often used within sport and exercise science to try and improve sports performance. So to give a kind of, top level overview of it, it starts off with a simple kind of question around whether or not improving an athlete's strength actually improves sports performance. And the kind of origins of this paper came from myself being invited to give a talk on this topic at ACSM last year. in a symposium along with Dr. Jeremy Lenicky, Dr. Eric Rawson, and Louise Burke as well, covering some of the kind of myths in sports science. So Jeremy spoke about obviously the relationship between, or lack thereof, between changes in muscle size and strength, and I spoke about the relationship between strength and sports performance. So it starts off kind of dealing with what evidence we do have to help answer that question. Does actually improving an athlete's strength result in an improvement in sports performance? And it uses something called the applied research model for sports sciences as a framework to kind of tackle that question. To kind of, we'll go through it bit by bit, but a general summary is that we don't necessarily have good evidence, or any evidence really, to suggest that improving an athlete's strength, typically for a resistance training intervention, for example, improves what I refer to as actual sports performance.
How dare you, James Steele?
What we do have evidence on is that strength can differentiate cross-sectionally between different levels of performance, so elite and non-elite athletes, for example. We've also got a lot of correlational evidence showing associations, not necessarily causal associations, but associations between strength and a number of proxy measures of sports performance, or proxy outcomes. So things like sprint speed and jump height and power and other outcomes. But we don't really, and we have mixed evidence as to whether or not resistance training interventions actually improve those proxy outcomes. And we have almost complete lack of evidence on interventions such as resistance training and actual sports performance, so whether athletes actually win more often at their sport. So the rest of the paper, after kind of going through and reviewing some of that evidence, then looks to try and tackle the question of why we don't have that evidence and what we could actually do, what some of the limitations of the evidence base are and the types of studies that we have, and then provide some suggestions on how we can potentially improve the type of research that we're doing to better answer that kind of causal question of whether increasing an athlete's strength actually improves sports performance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've got some just annotations, questions I made as I went through the paper. I thought you just made a great introduction there, but then going into kind of the next section, summarizing the problem and the evidence. There's one thing here that, well, actually, perhaps before I go into this, do you want to just start talking about this section, describing, the ARM, SS, and the 8 stages, and start going through this, and then I'll sort of butt in and pause you with some of my questions on this.
Yeah, sure. So the applied research model for sports sciences is a model that Dave Bishop presented back in 2008, if my dates are correct, which is generally a kind of framework through which we should be conducting research within the area of sports science. And really, it's a framework that applies to other kind of similar sciences, so the clinical sciences as well. And as I said in the paper, it's defined by 8 stages, which range from descriptive studies all the way through to the kind of implementation studies that we discussed in the previous podcast, looking at effectiveness rather than efficacy. But to kind of list through the different stages, you've got the first stage, which is to actually define what the problem is you're trying to address. The purpose of doing research is to try and address a problem, and that problem might be that we, in our case, for example, we're a coach and we want to improve our athletes' performance, and we want to know whether or not improving their strength by doing something like resistance training is actually going to contribute to that. And it's a problem because we have finite time. We can't. If we're doing one thing, then that means we can't do another thing. And so, it's a problem of interest to coaches, practitioners to understand. The next stage is to look at descriptive research to try and help us kind of generate a hypothesis. So it's taking a step back. If the problem is how to improve sports performance, at the descriptive stage, we might look to identify whether or not what sorts of characteristics might differentiate between performers at different levels. So this is where studies, like cross-sectional studies that compare different groups, become important. So we might look at a population of amateur athletes and a population of elite athletes in a particular sport, and measure a number of characteristics and try and identify, what sets apart the elite athletes from the amateur athletes, or even within an elite population, what characteristics differentiate those who are on the starting five of the team and those who are the bench warmers. So we start to try and pick out what things look like they might differentiate the two. But this is all correlational at this point, or cross-sectional. So they're associational questions. So at this stage, we're saying, well, being in that group means you're more likely to have this characteristic, but it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about whether that characteristic causes you to be more likely to be a member of that group. Stage 3 then kind of takes it a step further and looks to kind of specifically model those characteristics as predictors. So this is where we're looking at actual correlations. So, what is the association between the degree of strength that someone has and their performance in a particular sport? After we start to get the strong evidence for a relationship between certain variables and the outcome we're interested in, such as sports performance, we then move up to stage 4, where we start looking at actually experimentally testing those things. So we introduce an intervention that's intended to increase strength, and we experimentally look at the effects of that. So in trials in studies such as randomized controlled trials, comparative studies, etc. Stage 5 kind of builds on that. So once we start to get evidence of efficacy, which is really what stage 4 is beginning to introduce, whether or not experimentally manipulating the thing that we think will produce our outcome actually does produce that outcome, we then start to tweak it and look to see, well, how can we optimize it to try and improve performance as best as possible. And at this stage, this is all quite sort of like pilot level before we then really move into, they're labeled efficacy studies in here, but really they're the kind of stages where we start to look at applying them in the population of interest. So at the earlier stages, we might start to experimentally test our intervention in a population that's not necessarily athletes, because we're not ready to move into testing them in that population yet. And then we get up to stages 7 and 8, where we're really looking at the issues that we talked about last time, which is understanding the actual implementation and the resultant effectiveness of using these kinds of interventions. So this is a really useful framework to kind of take the research that we do have and use this framework to kind of like understand it in that context and see what kind of stage are we at with respect to our understanding of, for example, the role that strength plays in sports performance.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, I think obviously this stuff is quite technical, but I think it's just important for trainers and coaches to understand the methods behind the scenes that go into trying to understand this stuff. First question from me, and again, like some of these questions might be a little bit out of order, but you can if you want to address it later, James, just let me know. But one of the first questions I had is, in light of what you know about the way the way coaches in professional sports train athletes, and in terms of the way that athlete apportions their time for various activities, what do you think is the optimal configuration? If you had to, if there was a pie and you had to decide on what percentage of that pie would go to, game time, rest, resistance training, all these things. I mean, maybe we're jumping ahead, but I'd just be interested to know your answer to that.
I think if we read to the end of this paper, the answer is going to be, I don't really know.
I hate that answer.
I mean,
that's not good enough.
It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, this paper is obviously very much focused on strength, and as a result, on the implementation of, for example, resistance training. And because of the lack of evidence that we have regarding the effects of resistance training interventions on improving strength, and then their resultant effects on actual sports performance, it's really difficult to say from that perspective how much time should be dedicated to those types of interventions. Is it worth spending any time on resistance training if our goal is to improve an athlete's sports performance? Well, you could make an argument that no, they shouldn't spend any time on it if we just look at that body of evidence. But there are potentially other reasons why they should be, and we discuss them later in the paper, that a possible causal pathway through which resistance training might offer benefits for sports performance is its effects on injury risk reduction as a mediating variable. So if resistance training results in a reduction in injury risk, then there's plausibility to think, well, that's going to improve sports performance because uninjured athletes typically perform better than injured athletes. But there's still just a lack of evidence to make kind of conclusive statements around that sort of thing. So I'm going to do the usual scientific thing and say I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But logic and reason would suggest, from my perspective, that of course, if resistance training reduces injury risk, then that's something a professional athlete should be doing, right? I mean, even if it's just off season.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a practical perspective, one of the things we do suggest in the paper is that, given that we don't currently have any idea whether or not resistance training improves sports performance, but we do know it improves injury risk or reduces injury risk, then perhaps there should be a minimal dose approach to trying to implement resistance training around other practices within a sporting context to just provide enough of a stimulus to result in that injury risk reduction. And what is an optimal dose for injury risk reduction is also a question that we don't necessarily know the answer to. We know that doing some is better than doing none, but we don't necessarily know whether doing more is better than doing less. So having some element of resistance training in there is going to reduce injury risk in all likelihood. Whether it's going to improve sports performance is questionable. But we know, that actually practicing the sport that you intend to perform is going to have a bigger impact anyway. So you may as well partition your time in the most effective manner to maximize your ability to practice specifically the sport that you're performing.
So obviously there's, in the professional sports industry, I mean, we can take soccer probably as my best reference. And I know it doesn't help a lot of the Americans listening to this, but I know you've worked with you've worked in soccer, haven't you? Or you work with soccer players, I think, James. So maybe you have a good amount of knowledge, experience with that. So I was just going to say, you see in, I go on YouTube occasionally and I watch like the England football team, or so I'm going to say, when I say football, guys, I'm talking about soccer, just so you know. I see the England football team, or I see a Premier League team training, and they're in the weight room, they're in the gym, and they're doing all sorts of ridiculous things. They're kind of doing like some kind of hybrid of like strength training exercise, like functional training. And they're doing it, at a certain speed, with a certain load and intensity, and maybe they're trying to mimic an action within the sport. And I'm just thinking, is that got any transfer? Is that totally redundant? I'd just love to hear if we were to group those kinds of things in, I suppose, functional training, and what would you make of that? Do you think that's a total waste of time?
So I have a little bit of a theory about, or a hypothesis around what is typically done in elite sport, and actually a lot of levels of sport currently, because everything kind of filters down. Now, one of the things we talk about, or we cite in the paper, are a number of survey studies which show that even something as simple as resistance training, or quote unquote strength and conditioning practices, are common in a range of different elite sports. So, all sports are doing these things. And we also highlight research that suggests that sports scientists feel that their purpose is to improve sports performance. So knowing those two things, and also knowing that we don't know whether strength conditioning practices aimed at increasing strength improve sports performance, you could question whether any of it's really relevant if that's the intended goal. So coming back to this idea I have, I suspect that most of what goes on in elite sport goes on because it's elite sport. So athletes, coaches implement particular training practices because they feel that that's what's going to make them elite. So it's not necessarily, it's almost a causal relationship in the opposite direction. So becoming an athlete means you're more likely to engage in ridiculous, fluffy kind of
and be more resilient to it, right, as well.
Yeah, there is that absolutely. Whether it's having any impact at all is another question. And in fact, I made this point in the Q&A panel at the ACSM conference last year. I was surprised I didn't get lynched afterwards, but someone asked a question. I can't remember the question now. But in reply, I mentioned that sport and exercise science as a discipline is somewhat disincentivized to say we don't currently know whether or not what we do improves performance, which is a true statement. Like we don't know that, we don't have the evidence for it, because as soon as we start saying that, they're all out of a job. Why are we needed? There's actually an incentive to claim that we do improve sports performance and we do have an impact. So I think a lot of what goes on in those domains is I like Bill's old term of window dressing, and in fact, an ex-student of mine who has worked in a range of elite sports, much more as a practitioner. He's fully aware of all of these issues, but notes that sometimes the athletes are expecting those sorts of things because that's what they've come to think is needed for their sport. And so if you don't give it to them, it starts to have other potential ramifications on their attitude.
Psychological, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. My Pack, one of my PhD students who works as a powerlifting coach as well, he always uses the phrase placeboing it, and particularly like that population of athletes as well. They're always looking for that kind of like new sexy thing and as long as it kind of sounds plausible and seems like it works, if you can placebo them with it, then they'll buy into it and they'll lap it up and do it. So for those practitioners who are a bit more clued up, sometimes it's about giving the athletes what they want, whilst also making sure that you're not doing anything that's going to break them.
Yeah, striking that balance, maybe. Just on this topic, I wondered if part of that pie would be made up of mental training. And from what I understand, there's a fair amount of evidence to support visualization, working on the kind of mental side of sports performance. And do you have any, I don't know whether we're walking outside of your area of expertise, James, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, if I'm being completely honest, I think that pretty much every body of research, every area, every intervention is likely in very much the same boat as the topic dealt with in this paper, which is strength. It's just a problem with sports science more generally, and this might lead us on to the suggestions and other points discussed in the paper, is that we just don't do the right kind of research to be able to answer those questions. That even and I might be speaking out of turn here because I'm not hugely familiar with the research, but from what I have seen of even in sports psychology, looking at things like mental skills training, very rarely is the outcome that's measured actual sports performance. Like, do they actually win more? Oftentimes it's perhaps self-report outcomes. It might be other proxy outcomes which we think might be important for actual sports performance, but even then we may not know really how important those proxies are. An example in this is sprint speed. It seems plausible that all other things held equal, a faster athlete, faster soccer player is going to be a better soccer player, but we don't really know whether that's the case or not. There are so many other variables that impact it. Just making an athlete faster, making them stronger or making them faster, we don't necessarily know if that's going to really improve their sports performance.
Yeah, that's quite hard to get your head around, because it just seems like a logical sort of line of reasoning, doesn't it? It's like X equals Y kind of thing. But Yeah, it's I still having read that and heard you say that, I still have some kind of like cognitive dissonance about that, I think.
I guess I
So
guess one way
go ahead.
to kind of deal with that cognitive dissonance is clarifying that all I'm saying is we don't know whether it works or not. I'm not saying it doesn't.
Like we can't
Um,
prove it.
yeah, and we may actually be in a situation where there is a causal effect, but the effect is very, very, very small. And this then does become an epistemological issue that, you know, as to whether or not we can ever know whether it's having an impact on performance, because there are so many confounding variables, and the outcome of actual performance itself is incredibly noisy. It
Yeah.
varies on a day-to-day basis. You know, if we've had discussions before where um, if we're interested in understanding whether a meaningful change has happened, we want to know whether the change is bigger than the day-to-day variability that you might see in the
Mm.
outcome measure that you look at. Well, sports performance, actual sports performance, is incredibly variable, and it might be far more variable and far more kind of noisy than the causal effect that we're trying to determine from any kind of intervention, such that we'll never know whether or not we've had an impact on it,
Yeah.
absent, you know, huge studies to try and sort of like, you know, handle that variance.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that in a bit, because I know you do kind of suggest a study design that would be like, could be really effective, but it's just very hard to actually do and very expensive, cost players' wages and things like that potentially. So this just focusing on this section here, summarizing the problems and the evidence towards the start of this paper. I highlighted this bit, which I just thought was fascinating, which kind of, you know, we've already kind of said it, but I just thought I would dig into it with you briefly. So you said here, one issue with this evidence, talking about evidence that kind of suggests that resistance training does improve performance, is like you mentioned, it focuses on these proxy measures, right? They typically examine proxies of sport performance, e.g. rate of force development, power, sprint speed, change of direction, jump performance, rather than actual sports performance. Indeed, it has been argued that many of these proxy measures may be poor surrogates for actual sports performance, particularly considering the role of specific practice of tasks in skill acquisition. Experimental research employing interventions such as resistance training to increase muscular strength does suggest that many of these proxy measures improve, yet this is not a consistent finding even for performance outcomes that could be considered as actual sports performance, such as time trial performance. I mean, it's really, again, going back to cognitive dissonance. If, for instance, if you could show, a study showed that these surrogates for actual performance all improved, you know, rate of force development, power, sprint speed, change of direction, jump performance. Like, you would think that on aggregate, if you did that across a soccer team, right? Football team, soccer team, whatever, any sport, it doesn't matter, any team sport, you're going to see a significant improvement in actual sports performance. But yeah, so I still struggle with that a little bit. Yeah, I know there's more to it. There's obviously strategy, right, that might contribute to actual performance. Maybe you could talk about that. Maybe you could comment on what you think. You said it's noisy, right? Like, what you think actually does contribute to actual sports performance.
Well, I guess there's a few things to like. Maybe I'll couch it in a kind of a personal example. I used to be able to jump a lot higher than I can now. I used to be able to dunk a basketball.
Sad to hear.
I wouldn't really say, and I'm not collecting any data on this. This is purely based on my perception. But, you know, I'm not any better or any worse now not being able to dunk a basketball when playing a bit of pickup ball. So evidently, you know, my jump height reduction hasn't negatively impacted my performance. So you could look at it in the opposite direction as well. Like, if you were, and this is something that is worth considering.
But how is that? Surely, if you're, sorry to cut you off, but I have to at this stage. Surely, if your jump is better, then you're going to rebound better. You're going to be able to jump shoot more effectively. You're going to be able to lay up. You know, you're going to be able to lay up over the defense more effectively. So that's
Maybe.
where I.
But all of those things
Yeah.
also require a number of other attributes as well. And so the improvement in one, we don't know whether it's having negative impacts on the other, or whether or not, the improvement in that is just so small as to be completely insignificant to the outcome. If my jump height increases by a centimeter, but my timing's still, poor, my anticipation of the rebounds is poor, it's not going to make a difference.
That's very true. Timing is everything with those things. Yeah.
And so the skill component, I mean, I don't think anyone would argue that the skill component is, argue against the fact that the skill component is the most important factor. I think what would be debated is potentially the magnitude of benefit to be had from implementing things like resistance training upon performance itself. And this is where I begin to question it even more, because even in studies where we do actually measure actual performance, so sprint, the ability time, when we talk about time trial performance, that includes things like 100-meter race is a time trial. It's how quickly you can complete a distance in a particular amount of time. And even studies looking at sprint speed as a result of resistance training interventions are very variable in terms of whether or not they show a benefit, whether they don't show a benefit, how big that benefit is, and so that's where the actual outcome is the actual performance itself. Assuming you're looking at something like sprinters or other time trial athletes. I guess the only thing you could probably say, with some confidence, is that if you're a powerlifter, then resistance training probably does improve your performance, your actual performance, because your actual performance is a 1-rep max. But once you start getting outside of that, the evidence becomes more and more kind of woolly.
Got it. Yeah. So I'm just trying to turn the light back on in the office here.
No worries.
There you go.
I think we give an example later in the paper where we talk about this plausibility of a faster soccer player, for example. It seems reasonable to go, well, absent everything else, he might win more loose balls or whatever. And if he wins more loose balls, then that might ultimately lead to something else, and so on and so forth, until finally we get to the point where
so many steps removed. That's the issue, right? As you talk about in the paper, there's so many. Yeah. Okay. I found this absolutely fascinating. This footnote on this page, when you're talking about general adaptation, you say, interestingly, this lack of general adaptation is not limited to physical task performance, but in relation to strength increases. Salah and is it Gobet? Is that how you say that?
I think so.
Highlight the lack of generality of cognitive adaptation resulting from cognitive training, which is fascinating. So again, you mentioned just previous about how there's one of the problems in exercise science is they struggle to really measure this stuff effectively. And it's obviously very difficult to do. And so, and it's not popular to say, I don't know. So this kind of got me thinking, all these things people do to try and improve their cognitive skills, like Sudoku, brain training on the phone, playing certain games. Are we kind of saying here that, yes, maybe that makes you better at that specific task, but again, I know this might be outside of your wheelhouse, James, but like, that's unlikely to then transfer to better cognitive health and other activities.
Yeah, that's exactly it, and that's
right.
Exactly what the
that's so worrying.
That's exactly what that reference cited there looked at, and highlighted many similar sorts of issues that were highlighted in our paper as well. Most of the quote unquote effects that we do see in studies are often down to things like small sample sizes and they're statistical artifacts more than anything. And when they begin to be kind of pulled together and general cognition is looked at, there doesn't seem to be much of an effect. So much like the specificity of skill acquisition in physical tasks like sport and exercise, it seems to be a similar case in cognitive tasks as well. So, doing your brain training might make you better at doing brain training. It's not necessarily transferring, or at least the magnitude of its transfer is so small that it's difficult to detect outside of the typical kind of statistical noise that you see in those outcome measures.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so moving on, is there more to cover in this section, or do we now move on to, is it barriers to answering this question? We start talking about between person correlation and within person causation.
Well, I think maybe to summarize, it might be worth kind of just reiterating, because we tried to, we talked through the applied research model for sports sciences, which had 8 stages. And one of the points we make in the paper is that actually we only consider the first 4 stages. Because, and we covered this last time, the distinct lack of research looking at translation and implementation and effectiveness. But also, we talked about the idea that there's no point in doing that kind of research if first we don't have an intervention that we know has evidence for its efficacy. And so we focus actually on the first kind of 4 stages. And so it might be worth kind of just, we tried to summarize them and, what would the coach be thinking if they were thinking through those stages. So, we spoke before, stage 1 is defining the problem. So a coach might think, should I be committing time, athlete energy and recovery and trying to make my athlete stronger versus spending time on doing skill-specific training, having more rest, mental skills training, etc. Stage 2 would then be the descriptive research of saying, okay, does strength differentiate between elite and non-elite performers? Stage 3 then is the predictors. So are stronger athletes better at performing their sport? And then stage 4 is the experimental testing of that. So if I increase an athlete's strength, does it improve their sports performance? And we kind of summarize those 4 statements, or sorry, the stage 2, 3, and 4 as follows. So, stage 2, with respect to the evidence, does strength differentiate elite and non-elite performers? Yes, there's evidence that elite performers are typically stronger than non-elite performers in their sport. And even within sport levels, as we said, so though even at the elite level, typically those who are at a higher level are stronger. 3, are stronger athletes better at performing their sport? Maybe at the group level, as we said, there is that kind of differentiation. But when we look at correlational studies, there's only really data on those proxy outcomes. So for proxy measures of sports performance like vertical jumps, sprint speed, etc., there's some evidence that stronger athletes do perform better on those proxy outcomes. But then when we get to 4, does increasing an athlete's strength improve their sports performance? It's really unclear. For actual sports performance, we currently have no clear evidence on that.
On number 2 confuses me still. This whole elite performers tend to be stronger than non-elite performers. Can you explain that then? Like, why not improving the strength of the non-elite would improve their performance? Or is it just that elites it's correlation again, right? Elites just tend to have more strength, but it doesn't play a role in their actual performance.
Yeah, it could be. It could be some element of confounding in that strength isn't really the thing that's differentiating them. It's just something that also happens to be correlated.
It's like a byproduct,
the
right?
Thing that is differentiating them. We don't really, could be a host of things. It could also be some selection bias there as well. You take something like American football, and selection criteria is often based on performance measures like strength and other outcomes. So people might be being selected into those populations based on those outcomes, which they're inherently then going to differ on.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, although in that sport, again, I'd think that from an injury prevention point of view, there's probably even a bigger case for some sort of resistance training, minimum effective dose there, perhaps more so than in, say, soccer. I don't know.
Yeah, very likely. Another maybe good example, and stepping slightly to the side, is taking something like VO2 max. And if you take an amateur runner and an elite, an amateur marathoner and an elite marathoner, they're going to have vastly different VO2 max levels in all likelihood. Typically when you look at those kind of population comparisons or group comparisons on tail ends of the population, there are big differences. But if you take a sample of just elite endurance athletes, there's very little correlation between their VO2 max and their actual performance in that respect. And to some extent, then that is similar in well, I guess we don't actually really know, because we don't typically measure sports performance when we look at those correlational studies. We look at those proxy outcomes instead.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. All right. So does it now make sense to move on to barriers to answering this question? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So do you want to, if you can remember, because I know you wrote this so long ago, did you write this, or did you and Fisher? I know you wrote it with two colleagues, didn't you? Or was it you? Were you the main writer on this one?
This came mainly from the presentation I gave at ACSM, which was kind of the starting point for this. But obviously, a lot of this is stuff that myself and James Fisher have discussed a lot, and Derek Crawford, who's also co-author on there, we have been discussing some of the later points around things like minimal clinically important changes and how they're applied in sport and exercise science contexts as well. Yeah. So he became involved, particularly around that component.
Okay. Yeah, so obviously this paper will be linked to in the show notes if people want to kind of go along through the paper as we go through it. We know the listeners always love to read your papers end to end, James, front to back. So next section, barriers to answering this question. So do you want to just kind of go through this, and then I've got some questions as we go?
Yeah, sure. One. So I guess
you talked about this a little bit already, but I guess just going into a bit more detail on the barriers.
Yeah, so there's a few kind of, and I guess we can delve into each one as you want to, but we highlight, and this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but we highlight some of the issues in the current evidence base that prohibit kind of answering that causal question of whether increasing strength improves sports performance. And it's worth reiterating that, we have answers about the correlational questions of whether or not strength is associated with sports performance. We don't have answers to whether causally increasing strength improves sports performance. And so some of those things include, particularly with respect to the correlational evidence, and this is kind of a statistical issue, but confusing between-person correlations for within-person causation or within-person correlation, something called the ecological fallacy. And we can touch on that. There's a kind of visual example of what that is in the paper. Obviously, we've got the issue, which is just always an issue in our field, is small sample sizes. And some of the problems that exist with small sample sizes stem also statistically in that, and also just purely through how the kind of scientific publishing system works and the incentive structures around that, is that inherently, to find a statistically significant effect in a small sample, you need a large effect to be present. And statistically significant effects are more likely to get published. So what that does is it creates an environment where the literature becomes more rife with positive studies showing it large effects. And so we start to get the impression that there must be these large effects on whatever outcomes, but we might be missing the fact that other small studies showed negative findings and never got published because journals tend to favor these positive results, or quote unquote positive results. So there's that issue there as well. And there's I'm going to find the phrase because I liked the oh yeah. So we wrote. Ignoring for the moment that we still lack data on actual sports performance outcomes, it seems possible that many within the field, including researchers and practitioners, may be pontificating on false positives and inflated effect sizes regarding proxy outcomes for sports performance, and thus overestimating any benefits of increasing muscular strength through interventions such as resistance training.
That's crazy.
Another issue is
that's ubiquitous, though, isn't it? That is probably ubiquitous.
Yeah. Another issue which relates to this is a big focus on standardized effect sizes. So sometimes people will see studies which report these standardized effect sizes, which are often kind of labeled as either small or medium or large, without which are to some extent kind of divorced from what the actual units of measurement for that outcome are. Which for practitioners and athletes, it makes it more difficult to interpret, how meaningful those changes actually are. So that we feel is an issue as well, which is somewhat contributing to this perception that there is a big effect to be had from resistance training, for example, in improving strength, when really it might just be that we've got lots of false positive studies showing, quote unquote, large standardized effect sizes, when if we really looked at the raw units of measurement, we might be far less impressed with what those quote unquote large effect sizes actually are. Mm-hmm. And that leads into then, the question of what changes actually are meaningful. We don't really know how big, particularly focusing on this, the fact that we have mostly studies looking at proxy outcomes. We don't really know how big a change in sprint speed, for example, is needed to really have a meaningful impact on actual sports performance. Going back to the jump height example, if I add half a centimeter onto my vertical jump, is that big enough to make a difference? If I weigh that up to against how much effort it would take and how much time and work to get that gain, would it be worth doing that? So all of these things are really important to help us try and understand, whether or not what's being done is actually producing a causal improvement that is meaningful enough for us to care about it. And then obviously the biggest one, which we've discussed, is just that measuring the changes in actual performance is very hard. It's a very noisy outcome. Even within the field of performance analysis, which is focused more on looking at things like big data sets, things like Moneyball, looking at these, kind of big. It's so great. I haven't seen the film for a long time, but I recently re-listened to the audiobook.
Okay.
But yeah, even in those fields, it's still very difficult to kind of really tie, at least causally, certain outcomes or variables within sport to the actual overall outcome in terms of win-loss ratio, points scored, goals scored, etc.
Let's pause on that for a second. I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought about talking about Moneyball with you on this, and I thought, no, I might leave it. But the fact that you brought it up, so for anyone who doesn't know, Moneyball, which was I think it was obviously it happened. It's a real true story, but I think it was a book turned into a movie. With Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill, and it's basically all about how a baseball team uses statistics to I don't know, James, do you want to explain it better than me, because you know math and statistics better than me? So, like, do you want to describe that, what they do?
Yeah, I guess in one sense, they're using, and I don't know baseball that well, so I'm not going to try and butcher, because I'm gonna do a poor job of remembering specific examples or anything like that. But using metrics from within games and player metrics, etc., using those to statistically model which variables are predictive of wins and losses, etc. And it's it's something that became popular, obviously, from its application in baseball and the fields known as sabermetrics, which for the life of me I can't remember why it's called that now, but it does sound very cool.
But they used that data to obviously then buy a winning team, and they were able to buy that team really cost effectively, because other teams weren't identifying that these players were statistically very good or could contribute to the actual performance of the team in a big way. So they're able to acquire players really competitively, and then they didn't win, but they came very close, the actual team in the movie. Now, I actually, go ahead. Sorry, I've got.
Well, it's a great example as well, because a lot of the players that they were acquiring, the Oakland A's were acquiring, were players which would have been overlooked because physically characteristics like strength, etc., were lacking in those black players. You know, they weren't.
Well, they were quirky. Like one guy bowled strange, didn't he?
Yeah. So they weren't.
Pitched.
And this kind of goes back to my kind of almost kind of like sociological hypothesis of you know. In elite sport, there's already this kind of like zeitgeist, this belief of what's important, and you know, people do things that way because they think it works, not necessarily you know, because it does actually work. And so, you know, it kind of highlights that there are other characteristics which were far more important for performance, at least in that sport.
Yeah, I read an article about how no one has successfully done it in the Premier League. So for those that don't know, who aren't from the UK or follow Premier League, that is professional soccer in the UK, the most elite league. And I thought, well, then listening to you, I'm like, well, go figure, because we haven't actually got the data that actually contributes to actual sports performance. Like, we don't have that. Would that suggest then in baseball they actually had that? They actually knew? Or was it just a very good hypothesis that they then tested?
Well, I mean, that data, I mean, the actual performance
or do we have it?
in soccer is does your team score more goals than the opposing team?
Right.
That is actual performance, you know, however you boil it down. And you know, people will argue, oh, well, that's not really performance. And you know, I can kind of see their perspectives, but fundamentally disagree. Because it doesn't matter how good all of your other stats look, if you're not winning the game, then it doesn't really make a difference. And you know, you could argue whether or not you're looking at performance within the context of a single game or across a season or whatever. But I think fundamentally is like I don't know why it has or hasn't worked in that context. You know, maybe it's just that there isn't the correct there isn't the data on the variables that do seem to matter. You know,
to be fair, I am confounding the what we've been talking about here, which is data based on what contributes to an athlete being better at the performance of their sport versus, like, you know, assists, goals, successful passes, tackles, those types of things, which I think is what Moneyball's based on, isn't it? Those types of characteristics and traits, and
yeah.
to
And
actual,
that's largely what the wider field of kind of performance analysis is interested in.
Yeah.
And really, you know, this is where there could be a better marrying up of the type of work that sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches and practitioners do, and the work that performance analysis does. And we actually, you know, we make the suggestion in the paper that teams nowadays, in a lot of sports, do collect a lot of data on physical characteristics such as strength, you know, sprint speed, jump height, etc. All of these things, and they collect tons of data, and half the time they have no idea what to do with it. This is another thing of mine. There's an obsession with data because people feel like they should be collecting data. What to do with it? Who knows? But you know, we're doing science. We're doing you know, things as you're supposed to do it. You know, collecting data. We're being objective and making decisions based on data. But the reality is there could be much greater efforts and a research line in and of itself to try and better model and understand the causal relationships between those individual player characteristics and their, you know, like, for example, the impact of a player's strength upon their jump height, sprint speed, etc., and then the subsequent impact of that on, you know, assists, passes, you know, etc. And then ultimately feeding all of this into a model that enables you to understand the contributing the contribution that those factors are playing in the overall outcome. Do you win or not? And you know, this is a problem across a lot of fields, is that oftentimes data exists, but it's very disparate or it's not put together. And that's a big task in and of itself in terms of marrying up and connecting all of this data together to be able to answer some of these questions. But given the difficulty with doing the traditional type of research that is used to determine cause and effect relationships, which is experimental research like randomized controlled trials, they're hard to do in sports, partly because of all of the kind of sociocultural barriers that exist I mean, if you're a coach and a researcher, and you go in and say, "Coach, I want you to take half your team, tell them to stop doing everything they're doing and do this intervention. The rest of them can carry on doing it, and we'll do it randomly, and we're going to do it for however many months or whatever. Can I do this? If we do this, then we'll know for sure whether it works or not. The coach is going to tell you where to go, because they don't. It's hard to get their buy-in.
Yeah, I totally understand it from their perspective as well. That's difficult. Just related to this this particular part of the paper, it's funny because I think I talked about this with Dr. Dave Smith, who I know has worked with you and James Fisher before. But this also relates to people not knowing what the factors that contribute to actual sports performance. You have pundits doing post-game analysis, and then they sit there like omniscient, like know-it-alls, and they're like, well, this is why the team was successful. These are the factors that led to them winning, and maybe they're right, but they don't know for sure. I mean, they're just this narrative fallacy, right? It's that cognitive bias. Can you give your view on that and perhaps explain that? I don't know if there's more to say on that, but
I mean, this is part of the reason why I don't follow many sports, because pundits annoy me. But I can also, I think they're
so entertaining though, James.
Exactly, they're there for the entertainment purposes, and everyone feeds into the play. It's difficult because we also make an argument later in the paper about the possibility of integrating expert opinion into research to try and improve it, because in that sense, there's not zero information out there. It's just that we're not necessarily at the stage where anyone could confidently, people will confidently say it, but at least researchers should not be in a position. We're not in a position to confidently state, improving strength, improve sports performance. But particularly when it comes to trying to understand whether it is having an effect, expert opinion could play a role in helping determine things like, well, how much of a change in, what's a meaningful improvement in actual sports performance that you would care about? Because then the types of studies that we do, if we don't find an improvement as big as what they say is important, then we've by definition decided that this isn't important for them. If we can't produce an outcome that's as big as as big as the smallest size of an improvement that they would care about, then it's not important by definition, or at least from their perspective. And there's been little research that's used that, but we could be doing such a better job of trying to piece a lot of this stuff together. Like I said, trying to understand, doing experimental research to determine the effects of interventions on actual performance is very hard. So a step in the right direction might be to, part of that is because there are a number of barriers to that. One is that in all likelihood, we know we're only going to have a small effect. Small effects inherently need big sample sizes to detect. In some cases, we give an example of a hypothetical randomized controlled trial that you might do to determine the effects of, say, a resistance training intervention on some sports performance outcome or actual sports performance. And a conservative estimate, you'd need just shy of 600 athletes to take part in this study. And even the most kind of liberal estimate, you'd need about 150, which is already way bigger than pretty much any intervention study published in sports science. So they're really difficult to do. A better approach would instead to be to acknowledge, well, we can only do research really on these proxy outcomes. So let's try and find out how much of an improvement in these proxy outcomes we need to see to be confident that they might result in an improvement that's big enough to care about in actual sports performance. And then we can start to do that experimental research on these proxy outcomes. knowing better, for example, if we knew how much faster we need athletes to be to really make a difference to, whether their team wins more often than not, then we could say, well, we'll do a study and we'll measure their sprint speed. And if we can improve their sprint speed by X, then we know we've improved it to a big enough degree to care about. So, things like trying to understand those anchoring processes, how big a change in X do we need to see before we start seeing a change that we care about in Y? And then we can start using them to help us do the kind of research that otherwise would be pretty impossible.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So we're kind of moving into by the way, James, just one thing, careful not to knock your headphones on the bass there, because it is, right. That noise. Just careful with that. All right, so we're now talking about kind of what can we do, and you've mentioned there about anchoring. So let's see here. Do you want to just, because I know you literally just touched on it, do you want to just elaborate on what that means and the kind of method in terms of, what can we do to improve this area of research?
Yeah, sure. So we talk about it as being, the so what factor in the paper, and that's borrowing a phrase that is from earlier authors. So the example we give is in clinical research. This is actually quite common. For example, and I became very familiar with it because of the topic that my PhD was on, which was in chronic low back pain. And oftentimes an outcome used in any kind of pain syndrome is self-reported pain. Did pain improve as a result of an intervention? So we'll often use something like a visual analog scale. So it's simply like a 10 centimeter line. On one end is no pain, and on one end is the most pain imaginable. And the patient just draws a line on it to say where their current pain level is. So it's a really simple outcome. But there's been a lot of work that's gone into outcomes like that to try and identify, well, how big a change in pain on a visual analog scale do we need to see for it to really have made a difference to that patient? Like, how big a change in this do we need to see before a patient would turn around and go, yeah, I feel like my pain's improved a lot. And so this kind of research involves measuring these changes in this proxy outcome, pain on a visual analog scale, but then also asking for a global perceived outcome. So for example, you might do a study that involves an intervention, you measure pain pre, you measure pain post, and then you also ask the patient to rate on a scale whether their condition improved or whether their pain improved. So that might be, say, we have an example of a 1 to 7 scale, with 1 being very much improved, 4 being no change, and 7 being, a lot of deterioration. And then what we can do is we can beforehand decide, well, how big a change in their global perceived outcome is big enough for us to care about. So we might say, well, if they only say they improved a little bit or they deteriorated a little bit, it's not really big enough to really consider it a worthwhile improvement. So we'll say, right, we want to know what the smallest change is to result in the patient feeling like they've much improved or much deteriorated, if we're also interested in finding out what's going to be bad for them. So we could do exactly the same thing with sports outcomes. So we could, for example, get athletes to perform an intervention. We could measure their sprint speed, for example. We could measure their strength, and then we could ask them after the intervention to tell us, do you feel like your sports performance improved? And there's a subjective element in there. We might also want to actually measure their actual sports performance and tie it to that. It doesn't really matter, the anchor that you use. It's more the process of taking a proxy outcome and seeing how big a change in that needs to happen before you start seeing changes that you care about in the actual outcome you're interested in. And we offer kind of 2 approaches to potentially look at that, which is to say we could begin to integrate expert opinion, so the athlete's opinion themselves, the coach's opinion, and say, how small a change, what's the smallest change that you'd care about in these outcomes, and then use them to determine whether or not the changes that we see are meaningful or not.
What kind of changes do you think they would suggest?
Difficult to say.
You take a scenario.
So the example, we do give an example of where integrating expert opinion has been used in sports science, which is very, very rare. And so there was a recent study that looked at, this was actually looking at reliability of sprint speed measurements. So often sprint speed is measured in game situations in soccer. So that players wear GPS monitors now, and their sprint speed is measured using these different tools. But there's obviously an error inherent in any measurement. And so in this study, they wanted to know, they were comparing the reliability of different approaches to measure sprint speed, and they wanted to interpret the reliability of them based on what the coaches would consider to be acceptable. So they asked the coaches beforehand, how much error would you be willing to accept in these measurements? And anything, kind of more than that is too much error for you to consider it a worthwhile measurement to take. And then they determined and compared their reliability, the error measurements that they actually got in those different approaches to what the coaches said was acceptable. So a similar approach could be done with, and in fact, one of my students I mentioned earlier, Pac, is currently doing that. His research is looking at powerlifting performance specifically, but he has conducted a survey study of athletes and coaches, and also conducted some interviews studies as well, to try and find out what the minimal important change in strength would be for powerlifting. Like how much over a 6-week training cycle would be a big enough improvement for them to think that's important, so that he can then, in his intervention studies, determine whether or not the improvements in strength that he's produced are big enough for coaches and athletes to actually care about. The same approach could be done for any kind of outcome, any kind of sport. Is this big enough for you to care about? Now, there's obviously a way of doing that subjectively, as I've kind of alluded to there. So you could say, well, how big a change in sprint speed do the athletes and coaches care about? How big a change in strength do the athletes and coaches care about? In an ideal world, though, we would want to anchor them to the actual objective outcomes. And this is where, as I mentioned earlier, all of this kind of rich data that a lot of teams actually have could be used to try and answer these questions. So, over the course of a season, an athlete might be measured multiple times for strength, jump height, sprint speed, etc. There's also data for that athlete on their sprint speed in matches, number of passes, headers, whatever. But then there's also data over that season for the number of games that the team won. And so a lot of this can be used to try and determine how big a change in these variables are required to produce a change in the team's performance that's deemed meaningful. And then we can work backwards and come, as scientists, and go, okay, right, we'll use that experimental research. We'll use that in our experimental research to then test different interventions for you to try, then start look at implementing in practice.
You're making me think like the NBA Combine and the NFL Combine are totally pointless.
Maybe.
They have sort of it's funny though, isn't it? Because they have kind of almost they're like a cultural tradition. I mean, even non-American sport enthusiasts, I love to watch these guys did the combine. I mean, they're just freaks, like their speed over 60 meters is just crazy in the NFL combine, for instance. And in the NBA, you want to see the vertical jump, right? Like this stuff, they tend to correlate pretty well. But it's funny how they may be unimportant. And you see that actually, this is interesting. You see, I've seen this a lot where I've just, if I've sat down and got nothing done all day and just binged NBA YouTube videos, you see so many players who had really high, let's say NBA combine scores, who went on to have a really bad career or had a very short career or just weren't that great as players relative to the elites in the league, and vice versa. Some of the elite players didn't perform very well. I mean, Kevin Durant, right? I think he had a pretty terrible bench press because he's got huge long levers and he's very lean. Probably not as strong or advantaged in that way as someone who has shorter limbs and more strength. So I don't know. It's but yeah, he's like going to go down as one of the all-time greats. So there you go. Anyway, I digressed a little bit there. But,
no, it's a great point. And actually, cultural is a good word to use. And I guess it's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. There are sport is almost more fascinating from a cultural perspective, at least at the elite level, because largely the sports science that's done, and I'm in a minority that thinks this because, like I said, there's a disincentive to think this way if you actually work in that environment. But most of what's
that's
done
kind of sad to hear, though. To be honest,
yeah, it is.
That's not science, right? That's not science.
No, it's not. But it's the same in a lot of domains, and I'm that curmudgeonly kind of skeptic everywhere I go. I keep grinning, but
I wish, to be honest, I wish there were more scientists like you then, because that is the essence of it. From what I understand, and obviously I'm no scientist, but the more and more I learn about logic and reason and objectivism and scientific method. Especially with not that we have to get into this at all because this is a whole nother conversation, no relevance to my podcast whatsoever, but the rise of critical theory, what you're seeing happening politically with political correctness, like that domain of science is so beyond just messed up that it's and the fact that it's threatening other more hard science domains is scary, but that's a whole nother conversation. And James, I'm not saying you're in agreement of what I just said by saying that. That's just my own personal view. So go ahead.
I mean, you're right, and if we kind of loop right back to the start of the paper, most scientists, most sports scientists, sports practitioners would say, their main goal is to improve sports performance. And I've no doubt that many are very well-meaning and they do genuinely think that what they're doing is actually improving performance. But this is where, there would be a lot of benefit to have people who constantly question and debate those sorts of things, because we then might actually start to move towards better research that does actually produce results that are of value, rather than just things that we might hope or believe are important.
Yeah, like I agree with you. Like well-intentioned people are not bad people, I'm sure, but it's this it's the fact that they should be trying to constantly prove themselves wrong, because surely then your argument is just so much more robust, if you've tried to prove yourself wrong over and over again. Was it Peter Attia called it, it's like killing your own children, because you've got this idea, this hypothesis that you're really passionate about. I mean, I know I'm talking to the preachers that are converted here, but it's like you're just to prove that wrong again and to try and prove it wrong again and again is doesn't come natural in the kind of human condition. But that's why we have science, right? Is to remove all of those cognitive biases, to remove all of that, so that we can actually get closer to what reality is, right?
I always think of it like some other researchers and practitioners, and particularly a lot of kind of like public intellectuals and academics. I'm just utterly gobsmacked by their degree of confidence a lot of the time. Because I certainly don't feel that myself. Well, at least not anymore. I think of the kind of Dunning-Kruger curve, and I often joke that I'm stuck in the valley, and I'm not even convinced it's a valley. I'm just convinced it's just a pit that just keeps going down and down. And the more and more you learn, the less and less confident you become in anything. But yeah, it's funny. A lot of people they very much buy into their own hype, and it is interesting psychologically to kind of like see how different people kind of conduct themselves in particularly in science.
Hey there, it's Lawrence again, and that is the end of part 1 of Does Increasing an Athlete's Strength Improve Sports Performance with Dr. James Steele. I apologise for cutting this short and splitting this into 2 pieces. That's not my usual style. I like to have the exercise science reviews in a single podcast, but in this instance, we had to split the parts. So the second part will come probably late September or early October. If my memory serves me right, I think me and James are speaking again sort of mid-September to record the second part of this podcast. If you enjoyed this and you enjoy my other exercise science reviews that I do on the podcast, such as the ones I do with, again, more with James Steele and also Dr. James Fisher, among others, please consider joining HIB Business Membership. Within there, we have, again, a more in-depth exercise science reviews with people like Dr. Jürgen Giesing, Dr. James Fisher, and again, more from Dr. James Steele. It's also a place where we have a passionate high-intensity training business tribe, entrepreneurs in high intensity training who are looking to share experiences and learn how they can grow their business. And lastly, we also have lots of resources to help you start and grow a successful high intensity training business, as well as personal coaching from me in there as well. So if that sounds like something you're interested in learning more about, please go to highintensitybusiness.com/membership, and there you will see all of the details, everything that is provided inside the membership. If you enjoy listening to this podcast and you want to be notified every week when new content is published on your favorite platform, then please subscribe. So if you're on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button, or if you're on any whatever app you enjoy consuming content on, perhaps that's a podcast app, please ensure you subscribe there to get notified when a new episode is published. And lastly, please head on over to highintensitybusiness.com/tactics to get access to a free PDF on 10 ways to attract clients into your high intensity training business, as well as many other goodies there as well in PDF format. And that's it from me. So take care, look out for part 2, and looking forward to talking to you soon.